Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm talking about what I think are the best albums of the 90s by year. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you go check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlists we put together every week, and the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So when I look at what I think are the best albums, I try to be a little bit more objective about it, which is always kind of hard because music is so subjective. And I think it's, in my opinion, it's probably the most subjective form of art we have. But so when I look at an album and when I talk about what I think is the best album for any year in particular, I try to look at, of course, my influence or influence on me always kind of plays into it a little bit, but I try to look at how influential the album was overall. 30 plus years later, how it kind of holds up musically, and of course look at sales numbers and things like that. Also look at things that a little bit more objective than just my opinion of what I think my favorite album is. I will say that as the decade goes on, it got kind of harder for me to pick really kind of what I thought were the biggest, best, and most influential albums for any year in particular, like the last 3 or 4 years of the 90s, because music changed so much in the early part of the 2000s that I'm not sure how much influence a lot of those albums played, but I ended up picking some, what I think are some great ones. So for 1990, it's kind of the same that with a lot of, I'd say like 1990 through like 95, 96, I really had to kind of pare it down to, I was really between like 4 or 5 albums for each one of those years, because it seemed like almost every week it seemed like there was like iconic albums that were being released, at least in the first half of the 90s. But for 1990, I decided to go with the self-titled album from Social Distortion. Of course, this is the album that has Ball and Chain on it that everyone knows. A lot of other great tracks on here. Story of My Life is another one of my favorite tracks off this album. And, I think this really kind of opened the door up for a lot of other rock bands that, coming from the hair metal side of the 80s, music was really transitioning, at least in the mainstream in 1990. And I think where music kind of went outside of like grunge music, I think this album really kind of had an influence over a lot of that. So for 1991, in my opinion, it was probably one of the hardest years to pick, just because there's so many incredible albums that were released in 1991. It's probably, in my opinion, one of the top 3 years of music of the last 60 years. I really could have picked any number of probably 2 or 3 dozen albums to be my best album of the year. I decided to go with Versus by Pearl Jam. I know a lot of people, when they look at like grunge music and the way grunge music exploded on the scene, they kind of credit a lot of that to Nevermind by Nirvana, which I definitely could have picked also. It's definitely one of the ones I was kind of going back and forth on. But I think the longevity of Pearl Jam and how influential Pearl Jam has been for 30 years plus now, I kind of give it a little bit of an edge over Nevermind for 1991. 1992 was another great year for music. I don't think it was as huge as 1991, but there's some great albums that were released that year. I really kind of came down to 3 albums. I thought Core by Stone Temple Pilots, hugely influential album, really kind of showed that, even though it was kind of grunge, but it kind of wasn't grunge. It showed that there was a different kind of musicianship that was going on outside of, say, like Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, that kind of thing. STP did a bunch of great stuff. But I think, as far as STP goes, I think Purple was a better album than Core, so I couldn't really give it to that one. I also thought about The Chronic by Dr. Dre, hugely influential album, really influenced rap music for the next 25 plus years. But I decided to go with an album that I'm not a huge fan of this band, but I do love this album. It was huge when it was released, and that's Automatic for the People by REM. And it really seemed like this album was just like hit after hit after hit when it came out. And I think it won a whole bunch of Grammys that year. And if there's a REM album that I'm going to listen to, it's definitely this one. Hands down, one of my favorite albums of the 90s. And, of course, my favorite REM album. Even though there's a bunch of great albums that were released in 1992, you think of like In Utero was one that really kind of popped into my head when I first started thinking about it. It was actually a pretty easy pick for me. This album is one that, musically, is as relevant in 2023 as it was in 1993 when it was released, and that at least in my opinion, it's one of the top probably 10 or 20 albums ever released, and that is Versus by Pearl Jam. I've loved this album when it first came out. This is the album that, even though I was kind of a fan of 10, I was a little more of a fan of Nevermind than I was of 10. But when Versus came out, it was kind of over for me at that point. I've loved Pearl Jam ever since then. Like I said, when you go back and listen to this album, there's things that Eddie Vedder sings about on this album that are still relevant today when you talk about things like child abuse, sexual assault, things like that. That a lot of bands or a lot of musicians in the early part of the 90s, at least in the mainstream, weren't really singing about things like that outside of this album. So 1994 might be kind of a controversial pick. I think albums like Ready to Die by Notorious B.I.G., Grace by Jeff Buckley, two really huge albums that came out that year that really kind of stood the test of time. I decided to go in kind of a different route. This is still kind of in that grunge realm, but this is where grunge, I think, really kind of shifted and was doing a little more alternative stuff that was still kind of getting lumped together. But grunge was pretty much gone by the time 1994 rolled around. It's an album that I still love to this day. The album is 16 Stone by Bush. I think Bush did better things in their career. I think Razorblade Suitcase is probably the best album that they ever released. But 16 Stone is a really close second in my opinion. And like I said, musically, grunge was going in a different direction. I don't consider this album a grunge album, even though a lot of people do. Musically, it had a lot of really similarities with stuff that Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam and Nirvana had been doing in the early part of the 90s, but it had a different kind of musicality to it. I think, like I said before, a little more of an alternative edge to it. And it showed that, at least in the mainstream, that music, at least rock music in the early part of the 90s, was once again kind of shifting in a different direction. So 1995 was another easy year for me, even though you had this explosion of Britpop with bands like Blur and Oasis getting really huge around that time. 1995 also saw the release of an album that, in my opinion, is one of the greatest double albums of all time. I definitely put it up there with The Wall, the White Album, some of those other iconic double albums. I don't think this album is better than those, don't get me wrong there, but I put it up in that category with some of those other ones. That album is Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness by Smashing Pumpkins. It's an album that kind of took me a little bit to really get into. I loved the couple of the hits that were off of it. I got a lot of radio play, early on when this album was released. And I really kind of listened to those singles and didn't really listen to a whole lot, even though I bought this on cassette, I think, the day it came out. But over the course of the next 3 or 4 months, I really kind of got into this album. And it's been an album that, I have considered since then one of the top 10 albums overall of the 90s out of any year released. So 1996 was a really interesting year. I think overall the 90s was probably, at least in my opinion, one of the most, if not the most diverse music decade in the last 60 years. And by 1996, music was really kind of going off in a bunch of different directions. You had a bunch of great albums being released in a bunch of different genres by that time. I decided to go with an album that has been really influential over the years, ever since it's been released. But it's also an album that kind of brought together so many different kind of music styles. That album is the self-titled album from Sublime. This has got rock elements on there. It's got pop elements. It's got punk elements. It's got ska. It's got reggae. It's got so many different things going on this album. Even a little bit of hip hop, which hip hop was getting huge. Rap was getting huge in this part of the 90s. Like I said, this is an album that really kind of, I think, encapsulates all that different variety that was going on musically around that time. And unfortunately, with the death of Bradley Nowell, we'll never see or get to hear how great this band was going to become. 1997 was another really difficult year for me because of kind of how music was at that time. There was music was going in so many different directions, so many different genres. But you had, Radiohead releasing great stuff. You had Janet Jackson releasing great stuff. Notorious B.I.G., Wu-Tang Clan, all had huge albums in 1997. But I decided to go with an album that I might get some grief about this pick also. But it's an album that I think really kind of helped redefine this band, especially at least in the mainstream sense, and kind of changed rock music in the last or the later part of the 90s. That album is Nimrod by Green Day. Green Day was largely seen prior to this album as just kind of a punk band. You know, when you think of an album like Dookie, Kerplunk, Insomniac, you know, very straightforward, at least with Dookie and Kerplunk, very kind of straightforward punk music. Insomniac, they kind of changed their music a little bit. But with Nimrod, I think this was the album that really kind of changed Green Day overall. They kind of left a lot of the punk influence. This is definitely more of a kind of straightforward alternative album, in my opinion. There are still some very strong punk elements on it, but when you have a song like Good Riddance that is like the huge international, or at least here in the U.S., a huge hit, you know, in the U.S. here, we was played at a bunch of graduation parties and things like that, and graduation ceremonies, which, if you go back and actually read the lyrics of the song and understand the meaning behind the song, is very different than the way it's taken. I always kind of found that funny. But this album was really huge. I think musically, this album is where you saw so many different rock elements moving forward that were, you know, went off in a bunch of different directions and influenced really a whole wide spectrum of rock music, and did influence punk music also. I think because of the influence that Green Day had in the mainstream, you saw bands like Blink and you know, some of those other later 90s punk bands get a little bit more recognition than they might have gotten without the success that Green Day had with this album, and really with Dookie also. So in 1998, you had artists like DMX, Korn, Beastie Boys, all releasing huge albums. I decided to go with an album that this is the only album this band ever released. And it's probably, at least in my opinion, one of the most underrated albums of the 90s. Everyone knows this album for one song, but there's so many other great things on this album that, you know, it was, I think this is the last couple of picks for the 90s are albums where I think maybe, you know, my personal opinion kind of bled in a little bit on what I picked. But the album is Maybe You've Been Brainwashed Too by the New Radicals. This is the only album the New Radicals ever released. I'm not really sure what the true story behind it is. You know, I've read things that, you know, they just hated all the fame that they got. I've also read that the lead singer was really just kind of a pain to deal with and work with. And that's why the band ended up breaking up. But for whatever the reason, this is an incredible album, and one that, like I said, if you only know a couple of tracks off here, it's one to go back and revisit, because, you know, I obviously think highly enough to call it, you know, what I think is the best album of 1998. But like I said, overall, I think it's one of the most underrated albums also. So when it came down to the last year of the 90s, I was going back and forth between two albums. On one side, I had the Slim Shady LP, which I think is one of the greatest rap albums ever released. It was huge. It made Eminem the huge star that he is. I think with that album, though, I think the next couple of releases that Eminem did really kind of cemented his legacy and his legacy in music overall, not just in rap music. That's why he ended up in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So it was between that album and the album that I ended up going with. I think sometimes, at least with this pick, and same with 1998, I let maybe personal preference play a little bit of a part in this one. But it was this album and the success of the album that I ended up going with that really kind of pushed music in a completely different direction. You saw this huge boom in a kind of whole different style of music reaching the mainstream. But that album is Enema of the State by Blink-182. I think this album and the release, the success of this album and the amount of times you saw Blink-182 on MTV is almost daily that they were on MTV on all the different shows they had on there. But with the success of this album, I think is why you saw punk music in the mainstream for as long as you did, from the late part of the 90s all the way through 2003, 2004. It bled into the emo scene, and it kind of led into a lot of the emo stuff we saw in the mid part of the 2000s. And you can trace a lot of that back to this great album. Well, that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you think are the best albums each year of the 90s, because like I said, for a lot of those years, it was a really hard choice for me. I was really kind of down, really between, on some of those years, between like 6 to 12 albums, I was really kind of picking an album, and it was really kind of hard for me to narrow some of those years down. But I'd love to know what you guys think. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep all spinning. Peace.